Hello and welcome to the Of Interest podcast. I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz. In December, Associate Police Minister Casey Costello announced the release of a new all-of-government plan to tackle organised crime. Costello said New Zealand was at a critical time in the fight against transnational, serious and organised crime, and we need a stronger and more cohesive response. This followed work done by the Ministerial Advisory Group on Transnational, Serious and Organised Crime, which was chaired by Steve Symon, who's our guest for this episode. Hi, Steve, and welcome to the Of Interest podcast.
Hi, thank you.
Look, firstly, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and perhaps explain what the Ministerial Advisory Group targeting transnational, serious and organised crime is or was, and what it is that you've done to date?
Sure. For your listeners, they're probably interested as to how I became involved. My backstory is I became a Crown prosecutor in 2005 after a short stint of being a junior criminal barrister for working for Ron Mansfield, who many of your listeners will know. I worked as a Crown prosecutor for 20 years, and during that time I became a partner of a team, and our team did a lot of work for the police, but also we specialised in doing work for other government agencies, from Customs, the DIA, MB and others. During the course of which I became aware of the difficulties, of the challenges we have working across government to combat certain crime groups, and particularly organised crime. And that led to me being approached by the government to chair this Ministerial Advisory Group. The Ministerial Advisory Group was set up as a response to quite shocking or alarming wastewater results at the end of 2024, where we saw a real spike in our methamphetamine use, as well as a growing and slightly alarming increase in our cocaine use as well. The idea was to set up an independent group, so not someone from an agency who had a vested interest, but someone independent who could look at this issue and look at providing an answer or a strategy as to how we could combat organised crime. I was flattered to be asked, and perhaps because of my experience I was a slightly obvious choice. The benefit for me was that I got to choose the other members of the committee, and so I was very fortunate to be joined by ex-police officers such as John Timms, who has now gone on to be the Deputy Commissioner in New South Wales, Craig Hamilton, who was a specialist in terms of all aspects of money in relation to organised crime, Jared Gilbert, who was an academic who's done a lot of work with organised criminal groups, and Owen Loffenlechner, who had been in the police but also had done a lot of work with the banks, and so he had a lot of an understanding of how the private world could help in the fight against organised crime. And so I had kind of a dream team pulled together to assist me, along with some others from Customs, to help us prepare what would then become monthly reports. These monthly reports were being prepared to tackle different issues that arose in the organised crime space, but also to get the conversation going with the public so the public could understand the nature of organised crime in New Zealand and in the Pacific and the challenges that we face, before culminating in a report at the end of September where we had to recommend a solution. And we've done that, and I'm warmed to see that the government has been very favourable to those recommendations. And what they've done is prepared a cabinet paper and approved a cabinet paper to explore effectively getting the funding to drive a lot of our recommendations through. That work will be done before the budget at the end of May. And so that will be exploring things such as setting up an agency solely responsible for targeting organised crime. So having a Minister of Organised Crime supported by an agency and a body of chief executives, which I can speak to, and working with other agencies such as the police and Customs and others in our fight against organised crime here and abroad.
So one of the things that I think is interesting to explore a bit is in the introduction to the advisory group's final report, you describe transnational serious organised crime as becoming the number one threat to New Zealand's national security, which is a very strong statement. And I mean, just in terms of, for the general public who perhaps, luckily for them, probably maybe don't come across organised crime in their daily lives, or maybe in some cases don't realise they do. What are the threats and dangers of it, and how does it impact New Zealanders?
We try to approach it from the perspective of relying on our expertise, and my expertise as a prosecutor, and also those of the committee being police officers, those worked in private business, but also approaching it from the perspective of how does this affect New Zealanders? How do we inform New Zealanders about the extent of this threat? Most New Zealanders, fortunately, won't be aware of the problem of organised crime, but they will see the symptoms of it. The methamphetamine use, particularly in our rural communities, it's decimating some of our rural communities. The advent of the fraud that is spreading. 1 in 10 New Zealanders are the victim of fraud, and that number is escalating. And there'll be touch points that the public are not aware of, where they are interacting with people who are exploited migrants who have been exploited by organised crime, and they'll have touch points with them but probably be unaware. We will see new and emerging threats through organised crime, such as a black market in tobacco, which has been escalating in New Zealand. And if Australia is anything to go by, Australia is kind of our ghost of Christmas future. What happens in Australia tends to happen here. They have a huge problem now with the black market in tobacco. And these streams, the drug use, the tobacco, the fraud, are funding organised crime to both continue further crime and go into new markets. So New Zealanders are subject to it, but a lot will be unaware. But it is getting to be a significant problem just because of the consequences of drug use such as methamphetamine, the potential of new threats such as fentanyl, the cost to our communities through fraud, the exploitation of our communities through exploited migrants, and these things are growing and becoming more complex. What we're also seeing is organised crime working in more nefarious ways, so working on corrupting individuals, corrupting New Zealanders going about doing their work to try and maximise the return they can get from their crime.
And what about in terms of, the public service, or, we see stories every now and again about customs issues at places like Auckland Airport, which is obviously, the way that probably more people come into New Zealand than any other way, through shipping, that type of thing. I mean, how dangerous is it that people working in those areas can be corrupted by organised crime?
Yeah, organised crime is working more and more like large commercial enterprises. So when you think of large companies and how they spend their energy on facilitating and maximising the return that they can get for their investors, that's the same logic you should apply to organised crime. What they've found in Europe and in places as close as Australia is that organised crime has realised if they can maximise the likelihood of their narcotics getting through a border, that maximises their profitability. And so whether that's having means of transport which are undetectable to the authorities, or there's a growing prevalence of corrupting those individuals who work in law enforcement or work in border security to ensure that their drugs can get through. And so we've seen more and more the rise of cases such as the baggage handlers at Auckland Airport, which was a very clear demonstration of that problem. Not just one team of baggage handlers, but it was almost whack-a-mole. The minute the police and customs apprehended one team, another team was going. And that was to facilitate the smooth transition of drugs coming in, particularly from places such as Los Angeles, with drugs that had come up from Central or South America. What we're seeing is that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of attempts to infiltrate those at ports. And so that's the same with commercial vessels coming in through ports such as Auckland, Tauranga and others. And now we're getting the advent of longer and longer distance narco subs, so we're coming direct from source.
Yeah, that's a fascinating area. We'll come back to that a bit later. One of your report's recommendations is for a dedicated transnational serious and organised crime minister to lead the strategy, drive cross-agency accountability and champion system reform at cabinet level. Is the government going to actually appoint such a minister?
I hope so. Our recommendation wasn't made lightly. We were doing it in a landscape where we're trending towards less ministers, not more, less ministries, not more, and I'm not a huge fan of bureaucracy. And so our intention was not to create another layer. Instead, it was to coordinate. The big problem that we've got is that across our organised crime response, depending on how you count parties in or out, there's at least some 17 agencies. And so in addition to the police and customs, you've got others that are touching on different aspects of organised crime. So that might be MB with the immigration division, with their companies office, or the insolvency division. It will be other agencies such as the DIA and the gambling sphere. We've got lots of different agencies touching on different parts, but nothing really to pull it together and coordinate it. And we saw that, for example, where because organised crime is working like a commercial enterprise, it will work in new markets such as exploiting migrants in the Hawke's Bay so that they can maximise the returns through fruit picking and the like. And so that involves the police, obviously, immigration, the IRD, the proceeds of crime team of the police. There wasn't anyone to kind of see these issues and pull together the response to make sure we're having a multi-agency response. And so rather than leaving it with each individual minister having part of the puzzle, we saw an importance in having that being dealt with directly by one minister, one person that the public could point to and say, you are responsible for how we are going to address organised crime. And we also saw a need to have a champion, a minister who was going to sit in cabinet and say, look, we need to deal with these obstacles which are getting in the way of our response, such as information sharing. A constant refrain during our work and during my time as a prosecutor was of the difficulty of sharing information between government agencies to advance their response to organised crime. But you need a champion to drive that. You need someone who is going to have the moxie to say, we need to set up a data lake. We need to have a clearer vision as to how we're going to share information to make sure that we are becoming advanced and using our technology in ways to combat organised crime and become as sophisticated as organised crime is.
So sort of getting all the key government agencies to cooperate, I guess, more, that's a key aim that you have?
Getting them to work together more cohesively. And so we were very clear that we didn't want to create another police team or another customs team. Well, the police are doing a great job. Customs are doing a great job. There are some other agencies which can do a great job if they're brought up to the skill level they require. But what we need...
Who are they, the key ones?
There are agencies which have struggled, such as the IRD, with ensuring that they are meeting their obligations in terms of meeting the organised crime fight. To be fair to them, a number of those agencies would say, well, our primary goal is to be a revenue-generating agency. We're about collection of revenue. Organised crime is one aspect of that, but it's not our main driver. And so without being critical of IRD, what we need is to take that aspect, the tools that the IRD have to help us in that fight, and pull them and make sure that we're maximising those.
Okay. And what about the private sector? Where does the private sector come into this?
They play an important role. What we're seeing is organised crime trying to affect every aspect of our community. I'll use your example of the ports coming through the airports. Obviously, we have a lot of freight forwarders, taking your packages which come from overseas. making sure they go from the port and get to their destination. Obviously, it's the same with narcotics. So there's a role there in terms of those who are moving freight, in terms of the detection, the skills they can provide. And so there's a lot of work that can be done with, particularly with high-risk industries, to ensure that they can help us in that fight.
So I want to move on to money. I guess we'll call this the follow the money angle, because, obviously, organised crime is all about making money at the end of the day. And one of the report's recommendations that really sort of jumped out at me, having written quite a bit about money laundering issues over the years, is the recommendation to broaden the legal definition of money laundering offences. And this says, organised crime is all about money, and therefore money is organised crime's biggest vulnerability. In addition to targeting the organised crime, we need to chase the money. Money laundering offences should be designed to address a much wider range of behaviours associated with money derived from organised crime, and saying, it is well established that it's difficult to prosecute money laundering offences. So I guess the starting point here would be, why is it currently hard to prosecute money laundering offences, and what changes do you want to see?
Yeah, follow the money is the key. Like I was saying before, these are commercial businesses. Their driver, the thing that keeps them going, is money. The reason they operate in New Zealand is money. I'm not saying that we will cure the problem of organised crime globally, but we can make New Zealand the hardest place for organised crime to operate, such that they'll see other markets as more lucrative. We're effectively saying organised crime, don't operate here, go elsewhere. To do that, we have to make it as challenging as possible for organised crime to profit from it, to use money. It was so important to us and was such a agreed upon issue that our first report in March of last year was about the problem, defining for the public what organised crime was. And our second report in April was literally about following the money. The money laundering regime is a key aspect of that. Obviously, there has to be a way for organised crime to take the money that they get from crime and benefit from it, transfer it, launder it, whatever you will, into a way that they can use it. The challenges that we have in relation to the current money laundering regime probably best demonstrated by the small number of money laundering cases that go through our courts. We know that the drug trade is driven by organised crime, and yet we don't see as many. Theoretically, for every drug case you should almost have a money laundering case as well. We've had challenges in the past proving the connection between kind of your base offending and connecting it to show that that is money derived from crime which is being laundered. And so with the benefit of Craig Hamilton, we had quite vigorous discussions about how we might change the legislation to make it more useful. At the same time, we don't want to be introducing some draconian measure, which means the average Joe public would be subject to this. What we wanted to do, though, is make agencies more accountable. For example, banks more accountable and identify their role in assisting money launderers to commit their offending. And so by broadening the offending, we should still be able to capture your primary money launderers, but also we should look at the role that others play in relation to that, particularly where they are being willfully blind or negligent in terms of the role they could play in detecting and stopping money laundering.
So are you proposing to actually sort of change the definition of money laundering as an offence? I mean, how, in terms of the nitty-gritty, can you explain a little bit about that?
To give everyone comfort, this is not going to happen overnight. What will happen is it will go through the correct process that it normally would, which is that any change in law, of course, needs to go through a Ministry of Justice and go through in the usual slate that will go through. I'm hopeful that you'd have a champion of organised crime, a Minister of Organised Crime, and an agency to help promote and drive through and explain through the reasons for the changes that we propose. But what the Ministerial Advisory Group talked of was saying if we broaden the definition of of money laundering to encapsulate also that that turning a blind eye, if you will, to those triggers, and capture it with a lower penalty. So we're not saying suddenly we're going to send everyone to prison, but saying to have something to acknowledge or putting some criminality around those who facilitate money laundering, that would be beneficial in our fight against organised crime.
Okay. And one of the other aspects of it is that cash is talked about quite a bit in the final report. It actually says in the report that eliminating cash would be ideal from a crime prevention perspective. So before we sort of get into cash and what you've proposed in there, like is at a very basic level, what's the problem with cash from a crime perspective?
Cash is the primary currency of organised crime. And so a huge amount of our cash right now, as we sit here, is in the hands of organised crime, being held, like huge quantities of cash. We are a country which has always been great at taking on the developments in technology. We're the first to take FPOS in the world, and there is a future in which New Zealand will be cashless. Our point was, the sooner you make that happen, the better we are, because it will put pressure on organised crime to move it from a commodity that they can use to pay for these narcotics, and also push us into a transactional regime where there has to be a recording of the transfer or movement of these large quantities of money so that we can trace it, seize it, freeze it, recover it for the state. And so actually cash at the moment is a major problem for the fight against organised crime.
Okay. So the report is recommending requiring wages to be paid via traceable methods in industries such as construction, hospitality and agriculture, and also suggesting prohibiting cash payments for services provided by lawyers, accountants, immigration advisors, real estate agents, precious metal dealers and jewellers. How would this help? And is the government actually committed to doing any of this at this point?
The government's not committed to doing anything at this point. The government seems to be warm to exploring these issues and seeing whether the benefit outweighs the burden, if you will. I'm not trying to take money out of the wallets of every grandparent who wants to go to a bake sale. What I am trying to do is target those industries that have been exploited by organised crime. And you see from that list that it's quite a targeted list in some ways. For example, if we take the horticulture industry, it's to deal with that issue of migrant exploitation. There's a problem there where people are being paid in cash. We've got no control over how much they're being paid or how little they're being paid or what is happening with that cash. If we can have it done through bank transactions, we have a lot more control and oversight. In the same way with other high-risk industries, we don't want lawyers being paid with a bag of cash because, shock horror, if a lawyer's being paid with $10,000 and $20 notes, there might be something wrong with that $10,000. And a big question we asked is to say, well, how many of us are actually wandering around with large quantities of cash? How much of us are actually making transactions with large quantities of cash? And so what we wanted to drill down on is to say, well, do we actually need the movement of large sums of cash? Or could we control it, make it go through our banking system so there's more oversight? Most New Zealanders, I assume, will say, hold on, we thought everyone got paid their wages through an online transaction, going into their bank account and then they withdraw it. But there are some industries which have been particularly vulnerable because they're not.
What about cryptocurrencies or crypto assets, as some people prefer to call them? There's a lot of headlines globally about crypto being used in scams and fraud and crimes, etc. Did you look very closely at that in your work? And what are we seeing in New Zealand in terms of criminal use of crypto?
Yes, cryptocurrency is a major concern, and that's because of the limits we have in terms of overseeing what's happening with cryptocurrency. Effectively, unless you have passwords to get access to it, you can't see what's happening. If you do have the password, it keeps an incredibly detailed account of what has happened. And so there are difficulties there. Part of it is, if I take a step back, is almost this displacement issue. What we need in our response to organised crime is to approach it a little bit like whack-a-mole. Yes, we need to target cash, but if we eliminate cash, that will help us in our fight against organised crime, but won't eliminate it. Because organised crime, much like a good business, will find another way to transact. And so we'll see a movement to things such as cryptocurrency. And so that is problematic. One of the things we addressed was that there was a huge number of cryptocurrency ATMs around New Zealand. Now, most New Zealanders would have no idea that they existed, wander past them every day. A lot of them were inside vape shops or just outside your local dairy, where people could go in, put cash in, and get cryptocurrency out. Well, if you're organised crime, that's an incredibly convenient way to do it. And so one of the issues we had was saying you need to eliminate these crypto ATMs until we can regulate that industry, until we can have more oversight. We will continue to see this problem with the growth of cryptocurrency, and particularly around our ability to detect it. And there comes back to the issue of how do we ensure that our law enforcement agencies can have the tools to detect the use of cryptocurrency, to get access to those accounts, to see what's happened, and particularly to be able to seize the ill-gotten gains for the benefit of the New Zealand public who are paying the cost of it.
One of the key things about fighting organised crime must surely be international cooperation, because they do, these groups do tend to work across borders, which you will know plenty about. And obviously our nearest neighbours, probably the first port of call. I mean, you mentioned Australia. Some of the South Pacific Islands, probably all of them actually, battling with drugs and other forms of crime that's global. So, I guess one of the things can be that from a New Zealand perspective, we probably have to, as you've noted, look closely at what's happening in Australia, work closely with them, but probably support some of our Pacific Island neighbours as well, because there's the potential danger of, if there's a soft underbelly there, then that ultimately does immense damage in their societies, but also ultimately flows through here. So how much international cooperation is really needed here?
It's critical. If I can steal a quote that I heard, it must have been 20 years ago, from a representative of the American government. I can't remember whether it was the Embassy or Homeland Security. I asked him, what's the best thing we can do in the fight about organised crime? And he said, geography. Stay as far away as you possibly can. And he said, the benefit that you've got is you're a long way away. What has changed is that now the means of transporting large quantities of drugs have become more prevalent. And we've seen, with the growth of exports and the transport of goods between places such as Los Angeles and New Zealand, we are in haystack situation where the authorities are looking for needles, lots of needles, but looking for needles in those haystacks. And so we have to play, there's a real need to ensure we're working with our foreign allies to detect and stop organised crime. But we also have a huge obligation in relation to what's happening in the Pacific, because if you pull up a map, in order to get drugs from South America, for example, to New Zealand and Australia, these lucrative markets, the easiest way is through the Pacific. What that's meant is that whilst we have, as New Zealanders, seen the growth of, for example, methamphetamine since the early 2000s, we've had 20 years to get our head around it. What we've seen is a rapid growth of a methamphetamine problem in some of the Pacific nations in the last 5 years. And so they are grappling with these problems not because they are the market, they are a stopping point on the way to a New Zealand and Australian market where Australia and New Zealand often competing to be the country that pays the highest price for narcotics in the world.
Wow, it's interesting and frightening. Look, I mean, obviously a key part of getting the government to do more work in this area is funding it. So you mentioned at the start, obviously, movements to get budget for this. What thus far has the government committed, and what work is going on around funding all of this? And I think I'm right in saying, so you've advocated for a minister, but not a ministry. It's more getting existing groups to cooperate more. So what sort of budget is going to be needed, and how supportive is the government in setting this up?
Yeah, again, it comes back to my history as 20 years as a prosecutor and dealing with these agencies. I have been through, I came into started dealing with these agencies at the time of the financial collapse and prosecuting finance companies, and have carried my way through. I've seen the fiscal constraints that are on government agencies. I've seen the challenges they face. I wasn't about to suggest that we should have a huge amount of funding for a new agency. And I didn't see the need. Our committee was in agreement that what we needed was strong leadership through a minister and also through a chief executive board. And the example there was we had a border executive board set up at the time of COVID. That's where we realised COVID's a national issue. It doesn't really care about, which agency you work for. We've got to deal with this collectively. We've said the same with organised crime. It doesn't care. It's a national issue. We need to fight it collectively. And so having a strong board of chief executives made up with chief executives such as the police commissioner, chief executive from customs and so on, would be really helpful to direct traffic. But then thereafter, we wanted a small team that could go out and help agencies in their fight against organised crime. So not duplicating the effort, but helping the challenges that they might have. So if there's an issue the company's office can face, we want to help them have the tools to do it, ensure that they're doing it and answering their fight, rather than taking it off them, doing it ourselves. And in the same way, we wanted to have a team that can help drive through those changes, such as the information sharing issues, the data lake, which is too big for one agency to deal with. But I didn't want to have a big office space with great overheads, all the cost and delay that would have in setting that up for a big team to sit there. We wanted it to be nimble and efficient. And so when we've looked at budgeting, we've looked at it with that in mind. Try to keep it as fiscal as possible because we don't want to burden the New Zealand taxpayer, but we want to make sure that we are putting the right degree of effort in for the size of the problem that we have and make sure we're getting the most bang for buck out of the resources we already have available to us. It'll be very frustrating for New Zealanders to see different agencies holding different bits of information but not able to work together. We want to overcome those problems so that we get the most out of the tools that we have available to us. What that translates to is now a scoping exercise to say, okay, well, what's that going to cost? And so that's the process we're going through now where the government is saying, let's explore these things. Let's explore what the cost would be, indicative cost would be of the minister, the board, an agency of that size set up to do these things and to explore things such as the data lake, what that would cost, what's involved with that, and how it's going to work with other agencies to get some indicative numbers towards a budget that we'll have in May. I'm hopeful that they'll do it because this government has shown an awareness of the problem of organised crime. I've got to say, it's been hugely beneficial to have Minister Costello, who is a former police officer, who had done work in relation to immigration issues and was live to the exploited migrant issues and is a champion of those things. And it's helpful to have someone who you're not trying to educate as to what the problem is, but knows what the problem is and can see the difficulties agencies are having and wants them to overcome those issues. It has been great to have the support of ministers like Minister Mitchell, again, a former police officer who's alive to what's going on, who understands the challenges and how the police, although they're doing a great job in this space, have so many issues that they have to deal with that they could use assistance from other agencies in this fight. Minister Goldsmith, who understands the need to, sharpen the law if need be, and drive through that law change if the law is not fit for purpose. So we've had great support from that. So I am optimistic that this government will drive change. But I anticipate coming up to the election that most parties will be advocating to the public their desire to fight organised crime, and as well they should be.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously in an election year, a lot of issues come up that tend to take the attention of politicians who are battling to stay in power or get in power, whichever it is. So look, if we sort of finish off by, I guess, looking at how will you judge whether this initiative is successful? And I noticed that the strategy, I think it's a 2026 to 2030, a 5-year sort of strategy that Minister Costello has talked about. But I mean, the fight against organised crime is I mean, if we're brutally realistic, is going to be endless, isn't it? It's, there's always going to be someone out there trying something. So how are we going to judge whether this is successful? And also, are you going to have an ongoing role in this battle?
I must start with the last question first.
Yeah.
The government has approved this cabinet paper to explore these issues. There's been discussions I've had with members of the government about me having a continued role, and that's largely because it seems that they are grateful for the work that our Ministerial Advisory Group did, and obviously we could play in a role in helping say, how do you make that come to life, if you will. And so I may well play a role in that setup phase, driving towards the budget. And I've offered to help in any way that's going to make this as successful as possible. In terms of what success looks like, you're right. Organised crime is a generational issue. And one of the representatives from the police was right to say, you need to look at it, Greg Williams, was right to say, you need to look at this both as fighting this issue for our children's sake, but also fighting the issue right now. Organised crime is not a future threat because it's happening right now. It's currently affecting New Zealanders, but it may well get, and if we follow international trends, it will get much worse. And so we have to be fighting it right now. And so we need to be honest and say, let's set some metrics and say, what does success look like for us now? What are some tangible things we can point to and say, hey, we're having some effect? And that will be things such as a reduction in the wastewater results, so a reduction in the consumption of methamphetamine and cocaine and the like in the country. That's a great way of pointing to saying, hey, we're doing something. It'll also be looking at things such as the number of fraud complaints we have or the money lost in fraud, doing work to try and target that issue and drive that down, doing work to understand the scope of the exploited migrant issue, for example, and do work in that space to drive those issues down. And those are metrics where we've said, look, we need to have quantifiable data. We have to get data that we can point to so that we can explain to the public, is this working or not? And you'll see a big driver for our report was we have said, if you're going to take our recommendations, do the whole thing or don't do it at all. I had quite a bit of feedback about that because some were saying, well, hold on, is it something better than nothing? My concern was, and the committee's concern was, look, we don't want to have some like half-done, half-baked solution, which would give the appearance that we're doing something in the fight against organised crime, because our response to properly deal with it needs to be quite dramatic. And so we're hopeful that the government endorsing exploring this is a sign that they are willing to take on the fight to the degree it needs to be taken on.
Well, look, thanks so much for that, Steve. That is Steve Symon, who's chairman of the Ministerial Advisory Group on Transnational, Serious and Organised Crime. And I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz with another episode of our Of Interest podcast.